I noticed that my father-in-law's eyes were fixed on me. He was pretending to be busy, but it was impossible not to see how he was watching me. His gaze was no longer just sad and distant. There was something extra there. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but over time, the idea of provoking the old man became entertaining for me. On one of these visits, I decided to test how far he would go. As usual, I was cleaning the house, and the more I bent down or moved delicately, the heavier his breathing became. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. As I walked past him, the tension in the air intensified. I knew what I was doing, and his reaction made it clear that he knew too. Our silent game of teasing was becoming more interesting than I had anticipated. I knew every movement I made was calculated. He was trying to hide it, but his eyes couldn't conceal the truth. I knew that what I was doing was risky, but it was a result of controlling the situation. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, almost as if it was a game. I knew which buttons to press, exactly what to do to set him off. But the most interesting part was that, instead of feeling guilty or uneasy, I felt completely in control for a few minutes, as if I could manage his emotions. It was like he was caught in a web that I had woven. Every time I returned, the game became bolder, and my desire to provoke him grew. I knew I was playing with fire, but the question running through my mind was, how far could I go without getting burned? Over time, I noticed my father-in-law changing. The man who had once been sad and withdrawn was suddenly coming back to life. He wasn't as introverted anymore, and even his way of speaking had changed. Our conversations, which used to be short and melancholy, were now more lively and lasted longer. He seemed more confident. It made me realize how much of an effect my visits and provocations were having on him. I remember one day particularly well. When I went to his house to clean, I immediately noticed that something was different. He greeted me with a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't the usual sad or fake smile. It was real, a genuine smile. It was as if something inside him had awakened. Even his posture was different. He stood taller, as though he had regained a part of himself that had been lost. While cleaning, I could feel his eyes on me, but this time it wasn't just a shy glance. There was a clear intent. He seemed ready to take the next step, and indeed he was. He began talking more, bringing up topics he hadn't dared to before. He mentioned how New Year's celebrations made him happier, and he even hinted that he was thinking about meeting new people. I was surprised at that moment, I must admit. It wasn't something I had expected. His transformation was happening much faster than I'd anticipated. The man who once seemed lost in memories now looked at me with a sparkle I hadn't seen before. And deep down, I knew that my actions and provocations had played a big role in this change. But what fascinated me the most was that instead of feeling bad about it, I felt a sense of satisfaction and curiosity. It was as if I had awakened something in him that had been dormant for a long time. He was so fragile now. And it wasn't just my father-in-law. He now seemed like someone ready to make decisions. The confidence he exuded was almost tangible. This was only the beginning of something much bigger. His transformation intrigued me even more, and I wondered where this emotional journey would take him. What would he do next? More importantly, what would I do? As my visits to my father-in-law's house increased, the intensity of our game grew. It was no longer just glances or simple provocations. Now, every movement, every word, seemed to have a double meaning. It felt like part of a silent game that only the two of us understood. I knew he was becoming more aware of what was happening, but interestingly, it only made everything more thrilling. Each day, I felt more comfortable provoking him. He was no longer passive. I noticed him testing his limits with me, as if he wanted to see how far I would push him. On the other hand, I was enjoying the game. the idea of controlling the situation, of guiding his desires and reactions. It gave me a sense of power I had never experienced before. On one of these visits, things became even more intense. As usual, I was cleaning the house, and I noticed him watching me more intently than ever. His gaze was no longer shy or hidden. It was filled with intent, just waiting for an opportunity to act. The air was so tense that it felt harder to breathe. As I bent down to clean the living room, I sensed him moving closer to me. His breathing was heavier. I could feel the warmth of his body so near to me, and I knew that we were on the verge of crossing an irreversible line. He didn't say a word. He just gently touched my shoulder. And at that moment, I realized he was trying to take control. But the most interesting part was that, despite his attempt to assert himself, I knew the control was still in my hands. Because this was part of the game, a game of power and seduction, one that I had started and that had now reached a level neither of us could have predicted. When he tried to go further, I subtly pulled back, giving him a teasing smile and making it clear that I was the one setting the rules. Despite the confidence he had gained, I wanted him to know that I was still in control of the pace. This silent power game between us grew more fascinating each day. The question was, how long could he hold out without completely losing control? And more importantly, how long could I maintain this dominance without losing myself? It was an ordinary morning. As usual, I went to her house to help with the cleaning. But this time, the atmosphere was much heavier. There was a tension in the air, as if something was about to happen. While cleaning the living room, she was sitting on the couch as always, but this time I couldn't hide what I was feeling. The silence between us was almost unbearable. I knew she was waiting for the right moment. And so, unable to endure the tension any longer, I suddenly stood up without saying a word, and the touch she gave me felt right. It was unexpectedly direct, but filled with suppressed desire. She kissed me passionately without hesitation, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. This wasn't just a game or a tease. It was real. Despite her age, the kiss was filled with desire, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. What surprised me was my body's sudden reaction. There was no hesitation now, no resistance. I knew I could stop at any time, but I didn't really want to. There was something uncontrollable within me. I let myself go and touched her lightly, which only intensified the tension between us. She was completely surrendered, and surprisingly, so was I. It wasn't something I had planned, but in that moment, nothing mattered except the desire we were feeling. Up until then, I had control. But now, we were both in the moment. It was pure adrenaline. It felt like time had stopped, and there was only pleasure and intensity. For a brief moment, I paused and looked into her eyes. At every second of that moment, I realized it was a moment that would change everything, but instead of pulling away, I smiled provocatively and pulled back slightly, leaving behind a mystery.